All right, we're going to talk about stakes in short deck and analyzing, what stakes you're playing. How do the stakes translate to no limit hold'em or pot limit Omaha? How does a variance translate? If I have 100 antes, is that like having 100 big blinds? Is it like having 50 big blinds? Well, there's no short answer. The answer is that it actually, in this game, depends on how many players are actually at the table, and we'll get into why that is. So let's first talk about that. Thinking about the number of antes you have in terms of big blinds, because, it's all ingrained in us that in no limit hold'em, when we have 8 big blinds and we're under the gun, we want to go ahead and open shove our ace-king, and when we have, 25 big blinds, we're going to put it into our raise range, and once we get up above, 15, we can no longer open shove the pocket fives and all this stuff, right? So how does this really translate over to short deck? Well, first of all, we need to approximate the relative stakes we're playing by looking at how much money is posted pre-flop. So let's say the game is 1-2 no limit hold'em. There's no ante in this game. There's $3 dead in the pot pre-flop, or it's not dead yet because there are 2 live hands, but there's $3 that has been put into the pot before players have looked at their hand pre-flop. Now, at a full table of $2 ante short deck, which you might think is kind of equivalent to 1-2 big blind, but you'll find out is actually not. It's a much bigger game. There's a total of $14 dead in the pot pre-flop, or money that has not been voluntarily put into the pot. And this is because there are 6 players anteing $2 and 1 player in on the button for an additional $2. So if we look at this disparity here, we got $14 in the $2 short deck game, $3 in the 1-2 no limit hold'em game. What we can learn is that at a full table, at a 6-handed table, short deck plays about 4.7 times larger than the equivalent stakes of no limit, or 4.7 times as large than the equivalent stakes no limit. Now, the game actually becomes kind of smaller stakes with fewer players at the table. This is different than traditional no limit hold'em without an ante. It actually almost feels like the game is playing bigger with fewer players at the table. That's not actually the case. Of course, the variance is going to be higher and you're going to have to play more hands, but the game stays quote-unquote the same size as you increase or decrease the number of players at the table, and it's all a function of the amount of money that is in the pot pre-flop. Whereas in short deck, the amount of money that's in the pot before the cards are dealt is dependent on the number of players at the table. Now you might say, well, Kane, that's also true in no limit hold'em with an ante. It is not with no limit hold'em with big blind ante, however. Now that a lot of tournaments have instituted the big blind ante, the pot size pre-flop stays constant independent of the number of players who are sitting at the table. Now, with the old ante structure where every player anteed individually, you would see the pot get bigger or smaller based on the number of players at the table. However, because the blinds were large relative to the antes, it actually mattered less in no limit hold'em than it did in short deck. In short deck, the game can go from, in a heads up scenario, being a relatively small game to being huge once it's a full table with 6 or more players. So again, let's go ahead and use our example. In 1-2 no limit hold'em, there's $3 in the pot pre-flop when the cards are dealt. At a heads up table of short deck with a $2 ante, there's only $6 posted blind in the pot pre-flop. So here we got both players putting in $2 antes, and then you got $2 from the button for $6. So as you can see, doing our same math we did last time, it is twice as large the heads-up short deck game with a $2 ante is twice as large as the 1-2 no-limit hold'em game. So in general, for equivalent stakes, so when I say equivalent stakes, it means comparing the big blind in the no-limit hold'em game to the ante in the short deck game. If those two numbers are the same, right, then short deck ranges from being a 2x to 4.67x bigger game than no limit hold'em as the number of players at the short deck table approaches 6 from 2. Right now, of course, there are some games where short deck, I've seen it played 7-handed. I've actually online it's been played as 9-handed, which is pretty crazy. But as the number of players gets higher and higher, the game actually becomes larger and larger. And here's just a final summary of that information, and it's just, you can either commit this chart to memory or snap a picture on your phone so that, when you're playing, you know what you're working with here. This is just a chart that basically tells you the number of players who are in the short deck game and how much larger it's going to play than no limit hold'em. So as you can see, our top row here, we're talking about the big blind multiplier. So in other words, if the game is a $2 ante short deck game and it's being played heads up, well, then the equivalent stakes for no limit hold'em will be $2, $4, right? Because remember, there's $6 dead preflop. But what happens if it's a full table? If it's 6-handed? Well, now all of a sudden it's kind of playing like almost a 5-10 no limit hold'em game, right? Just 5-9. I've never played a 5-9 no limit hold'em game, but the point is that there is $14 dead in the pot preflop, right? Now let's talk about this. Also affects how deep stacked you are in the game. In other words, when you're looking at a hand where this is a hand where I would stack off if in no limit hold'em if I had 10 big blinds, but if I had 25 big blinds, I wouldn't stack off. Well, here's a great way to gauge your relative number of big blinds, right? If you want to think about the number of antes you have in front of you, because it's more intuitive to you in terms of big blinds, which I actually advocate that you should think about it that way, because again, the way that 100 antes plays in short deck when it's 4-handed is entirely different than the way that 100 antes plays when it's 6-handed. Because look at this, when it's 4-handed, 100 antes is playing more like 30 big blinds, because what we're doing is we're taking the total number of antes we have, dividing it by this multiplier, and that's where we get this number. But when it is 6-handed, your 100 antes is basically only playing like 21 and a half big blinds. So, and then of course if we go down to 50 antes, and you're playing heads up, it plays more like 25 antes. And when there's 6 players at the table, your 50 antes is playing like 11 big blinds. That's why in my 50 ante chart, when you take a look at that, you're going to find that we have a very substantial shoving range in that chart, and not a raising range. There's no open raising range. It's either you're limping or you're shoving. And it's also why you're going to find that in our 100 ante chart, because our 100 antes plays a little bit more like 21 or 22 big blinds, you're not going to see any 3-bet folding. In no limit hold'em, you don't 3-bet fold with 22 big blinds, right? Well, that's why in this game you should not be 3-bet folding either. However, when you are playing heads up over here, even if you have 100 antes, now even though my 100 ante chart and even though some of my other slides have said, hey, when you're playing 100 antes, 3-bet folding isn't a thing, that was when it was 6-handed. That was when the game was larger because there were 6 players at the table. When there are only 2 players at the table, it's effectively like you have 50 big blinds. So now when your opponent opens and you do choose to re-raise, his size was smaller, your size was smaller. So let's say you're playing heads up and you're playing a $1 ante game. There's $2 dead in the middle. You got $1 posted on your button. He makes it 4 out of position, right? A little bit less than pot, 80% pot. You can raise there to 13 and still fold. You're not committed to your 100 antes. You can now, in heads up, you can now abandon that just shove over an open strategy that we advocated when there are 6 players at the table. So, and then of course when you have 3 or 4 players on the table, it's closer to, it's somewhere in the middle. Certainly with 3 players, we can now start to have a 3-bet fold range in some sort of spots. I would make, a very specific polar type of 3-bet fold range, but I'd still have my 3-bet shove range, including, a lot of my hands like the ace kings and the jack tens and those type of hands, and then I'd have a more polar 3-bet fold range, including hands like pocket aces and pocket kings and ace 7 suited and those type of hands. So snap a picture of this, put it on your phone, or pull up this chart. It'll likely be linked below on the site, just so whenever you're in the game you can just figure out, the most important thing is figuring out, okay, how many big blinds are my antes acting like, right? There are 5 players at the table, and I have 180 antes. How many big blinds is that like in No Limit Hold'em? Well, what you do is you'd find 5 players. You'd find that 100 antes is like 25. So what are we going to do? We're going to multiply this by 1.8, right? Because that would get us to 180 antes here. And the answer to that on the top of my head is 45 big. It would play a lot like 45 big blinds. So yeah, I hope that this helps. And the other aspect here is you actually know what stakes you're playing. This way you don't sit down in a $1 ante game and you're like, oh great, it's like I'm playing 50 cents a dollar. No, it's like you're playing much, much bigger than that. If you're playing in a full a 6-handed $1 ante game, you're effectively playing, something like a 2-5 game, 2-5 No Limit Hold'em, something like that. So thanks for tuning in, guys.